Thanks, everyone. I better start by just moving all this merchandise out of the way. Good afternoon. It's really great to be here, and congratulations to G Research for assembling a fascinating lineup. And I can obviously say that with some confidence because I've been invited to become part of it. And seeing as we're here at the Odeon, as Christoph has said, he's already had the product placement. This is the scene of many, many red carpet premieres. I wanted to spend the next 45 minutes talking about a company I think is a real British blockbuster, which is a company called Arm. It's a microchip designer. I think many of you will have heard of it. So it's 34 years old. I'm going to spend effectively 43 minutes talking about those 34 years, how it began, how it grew to prominence, and what the future might hold. So why me? As Christoph said, I'm a financial journalist. I certainly have been. I wrote a book on Arm, which came out last May, so I've put in a few hours in reading and writing about this company. And why Arm? This is a question I've been asked quite a lot over the last 3 years. And I really wanted to tell a story of a British success. It had to be modern, it had to be global, it had to be high-tech. And the UK is incredibly innovative, but we don't generate enough world beaters. So Arm stands out, not just because it's inserted itself into an industry which I think is still defined by that US-Asia axis. The US really where the development brains have traditionally been for this industry, and the reason that the industry has kept up with Moore's Law for so long, I think, has a lot to do with the manufacturing brawn and innovation that we've seen coming out of Asia. And I've always been fascinated how startups scale up and others fall by the wayside, how good judgment combines with luck, which is hugely important in business. And a key step to me is how companies take that luck and they become a success in their time, and they convert that into being a success for all time. And I think something about Arm, which I try to put into the book and I'll try to talk about now, is how it has achieved that indispensability. And it's done that by working with everyone, really, with a lot of companies that are great rivals, today's modern industrial titans: NVIDIA, Apple, Amazon, Samsung, Qualcomm, Xiaomi, Huawei, Alibaba, Meta, the list goes on. And I'm going to tell that story through 6 relationships. But first of all, some numbers. We know that Arm is big. Its technology reaches 70% of the world's population. This is the stat they came up with in their recent IPO prospectus. Now just think about that and compare that with other UK exports. Think about how many people watch Premier League football at the weekend. Think how many people are out in this cold weather around the world in their Burberry raincoat. Nowhere near 70% of the world's population. 30 billion or more ARM-based chips were shipped last year. And to give you an idea of scale, that's 100 times the number of iPhones and iPads that Apple sold in the last 12 months. But the company is smaller than you might think. And we've seen this from the financials that they've shared as they've gone on to NASDAQ in the last couple of months. It makes about $500 million a year. Not a huge amount compared to a lot of the tech companies that it's serving, and it does that off the back of revenues of 2.7 billion. And I did a graphic. I have to apologize to Michael because this NVIDIA share price is going up so quickly. This slide hasn't actually kept track with NVIDIA, which is now worth 1.3 trillion, Intel 200 billion, and a third of Intel is Arm, currently at 70 billion. So what is it selling? What's the next slide say? It will tell me. What is Arm selling? It's selling access to its instruction set architecture. This is the rule book or the dictionary for chip design. It's a common language that determines how the central processing unit, the CPU, the brains of the outfit, is being controlled by the software, how it executes the instructions of a computer program. And that predictability has been essential to its success over the last generation or so. Today, there are 15 million software developers working within the Arm architecture. And it's in everything from laptops to industrial sensors, mobile phones, and cars, and so on. And companies buy a license to the ISA and then pay a royalty to use it. So what you see in these numbers, and this will talk to the rest of the story, is ARM has traded off between ubiquity and profitability. If it had charged more in royalties down the years, it would have delivered far more for shareholders. It would have been a larger company, but it undoubtedly would have faced more competition. I'll come on to why it didn't, and also where the competition will come from nevertheless. Very quickly, the next slide is just some pictures of some very old things. The march of the microchips, seeing as I'm here to do the historical perspective before the other chaps look forward. The march of the microchip, very much summing up the global race writ large, Moore's law, doubling of that component density. The integrated circuit broke through in the 60s. All it needed to find was a customer base. People didn't want to pay for it initially. So that initial customer base came out of the defense industry in the 60s, the Minuteman ballistic missile, and the moon landing. JFK was a great fan of the US electronics industry. In the 70s, that shifted towards consumer electronics. Calculators, the must-have device in the 1970s. I wasn't there for very long, but people apparently everyone wanted these on their desk as a status symbol. And then the home computer, and the picture here is the IBM PC from 1981, which was the first time that Wintel came together, the Intel chip with the what became the Microsoft operating system. And now chips being everywhere. Interestingly, in the shortage year, this was 2021 when we were all stuck at home, we couldn't get our PS5s that year because there was a chip shortage. Only 1.15 trillion chips were shipped around the world. And I love the description of them. A former vice chairman of Samsung Electronics calls microchips industrial rice, feeding appetites across industries, absolutely. And just one other point to mention on trends, which I think has really infused this industry over 50, 60 years. It was an all-American industry from the start. In the rush to commercialize, in the rush to drive down the price and scale up volume production, that's when manufacturing went east. It went east a lot longer ago than I thought in writing the book. The first outsourced manufacturing plant for transistors was actually set up in 1963 in Hong Kong, so this wasn't any sort of recent innovation. US chip manufacturing share slumped over the decades. Wall Street loved it, more profit. Capitol Hill hated it, less control. And that really talks to the challenges we've got today between US, China, and the geopolitical tussle and silicon sovereignty. And the second trend I would talk about, fragmentation as well, is sectoral. What happened in this industry going through the 80s and the 90s, the great capital intensity of investing in this new technology meant that companies that tried to do everything largely disappeared. Something like Intel is a bit of an anomaly today. There was great focus on supply chain niches, and you have those today that set up decades ago. Powerful players in most segments. So TSMC in manufacturing, the inventors of the foundry model, we don't design, we just make, we make brilliantly, was born in 1987. ASML, the lithography machines, that are effective monopolies in the way that they can project designs onto silicon wafers at the smallest process nodes possible. Came out of Philips in 1984 and was built up through the 90s. And just as ARM was being born in the 1990s, companies took the view that some basic components of design, the building blocks of chip design, was not something they needed to own. There was a number of companies that were known as cell libraries that were spun out and jettisoned, and this was the point at which chip designers thought, if I need it, if I need the basic stuff, I'll buy it in. I want to go back briefly now, and I won't linger on this. I think the origin story of ARM gets told quite a lot. Acorn was born in 1978, and it had played with computers early on. It had an early model out called the Atom. I should just say, it's interesting you're all sat here with your popcorn this afternoon. One of the things that Acorn did to recruit brilliant young minds, the academics from the computing department of Cambridge University, was let it be known that every afternoon at 4 o'clock there was tea and there was buns from Fitzbilly's, the best bakery in Cambridge. Come round to the Acorn office off Market Hill. Tell us all your brilliant ideas and perhaps join the company. So it's good to see that that mode of recruitment carries on many decades later. What changed for Acorn was it won the tender to supply the BBC Micro. This was the computer that sold like wildfire. It was being promoted on the BBC series that taught the UK how to compute, and it was also discounted and sold into schools. So it was in homes, it was in classrooms, it was boom time for Acorn. That didn't last very long at all, and it was pretty much bust by 1985. Fortunately, the company had thought ahead. Many of the home computers at that time had very different cases, very different boxes, but actually the chip inside was the same. It was the 6502, if anybody was interested in that. Acorn thought, if we can develop our own chip, we can leapfrog the competition, and it dispatched 2 engineers to look at that. There were various things that they had to observe. It had to be simple, and it had to be really cheap, because they'd sold lots of Acorn electrons, but they didn't really have very much money. This was known as Project A, and one of the first decisions that Roger Wilson, later Sophie and Steve Ferber, made was RISC over CISC. They obtained some research papers from Berkeley University in California that proposed a reduced instruction set computer. This was a RISC chip. And this is valid because even at this early stage, the industry was at a fork in the road. RISC fans said that CISC chips, which is the complex instruction set, were just consuming too much power. They were over-designed, they were over-specced. RISC fans argued that 80% of the time, the chip typically used just 20% of its instructions. So junk all the stuff that wasn't being used, break everything down into a handful of instructions, it would be quicker and it would use less power. And it's that ideology that really flashes forward down the decades, low cost, low power, and it's something that ARM has applied over industry after industry. In the end, the ARM 1 that debuted in April 1985, the ambition was for 10x performance versus the BBC Micro. They came up with 25x, and Acorn RISC machines, ARM, was born. The only problem was who was going to use it. It did get used in an Acorn computer, but if you fast forward 5 years, and there's a very young Steve Jobs. If you fast forward 5 years, really nobody was using it, and the people who were designing this architecture and working on it, 5 years is an age in this industry, were a little bit frustrated. And actually there were other RISC companies that we forget about and are not talked about anymore. Something called MIPS Computer Systems came out of Stanford. That was the one to watch back then. If Apple hadn't come along, the whole ARM idea would have been slung in the cupboard and be forgotten to history. It just happened that Apple needed some new ideas. And the chief exec who ran Apple after Jobs had resigned in '85 was a chap called John Sculley. He became very, very interested in something called the Knowledge Navigator. This was kind of a fantasy machine. It was a fantasy for the whole industry, because the industry then, just as in the 70s from 80s, it was thinking, how can I shrink a mainframe into a laptop or a home computer? Then the challenge was, how can I make something truly portable? And the Knowledge Navigator popped up in John Sculley's autobiography, still available, Odyssey from 1987. I've got a copy, not surprisingly, and various speeches that he gave at that time. So they threw some money at it, and they were working with AT&T, the great US telecoms monopoly, which had a giant chip division. But it wasn't working because AT&T was a big company, not for the last time in ARM's history. It couldn't produce something that was low power enough and that was cheap enough. So the other chap here, Larry Tesler, who became Apple's chief scientist, took over this project and looked around for an alternative. Through various routes, which I won't go into, he heard about the ARM project, and a joint venture was struck in 1990. ARM was born. The deal was that Apple didn't want to deal with Acorn, which had been a competitor. It wanted to spin out the company. What was it that drew Apple to ARM at that time? Many variables. The performance and price certainly worked for it, and it was customizable. Apple wasn't a big buyer of this product at the time. It wasn't anything like the company that it is today. And simply put, for the price of the joint venture, $2.5 million, it was far less than the cost of trying to fix the AT&T problem. So So far, so lucky. ARM began life, 13 men working from a 17th century barn 8 miles outside of Cambridge. Cambridge was too expensive. And it was all run on the cheap. They even won their boardroom table in a coin toss. The first chief executive was a chap from Motorola, Robin Saxby, and he realized that the volumes that Apple and Acorn were promising to take from the company would not have been anything like enough to sustain a business. So he had eyes very early on how could this architecture and these design standards become an international standard. And that meant getting on a plane a lot. It meant going particularly to see Asian electronics companies. Sharp from Japan was an early customer. Did they ever think about making their own chips? No, they didn't. They didn't have the money to do that. And also, I think they thought that there was something quite modern and forward-looking in selling an idea, selling a pattern, rather than selling a physical product. Did they know where the markets would emerge from? They didn't. If you asked them in 1994, and I've asked a number of the 13 men in the barn, if you asked them in 1994, was it going to be games makers, was it going to be Nintendo, which was the big breakthrough for them, or was it going to be the mobile industry, they would almost all have said, well, it's going to be Nintendo, it's going to be the games consoles and the cartridges and all the stuff around that. Two things happened. The Nordic telco operators, Nokia and Ericsson in particular, had a very strong desire to conquer mobility. The GSM standard really helped them because that was something that would operate across numerous companies. And also Texas Instruments, an old name from the chip industry, had lost many battles and many markets to break into, but it wasn't going to lose with its communication chip, with its digital signal processor. It was looking for high volume applications, and it was going hunting in Finland and in Sweden, talking to Ericsson and Nokia. It needed help, and it licensed ARM, and that's what really made the industry stand up and take notice. I'm not going to talk about that. Now, this is it. None of you will have had one, I imagine, but this is very much a relic from history. This is the 6110 Nokia phone that came out in December 1997. Why was it called the Mad Phone? The problem that Nokia had to solve was it needed handsets to be small enough to slip in a bag or a pocket, but really the challenge for the mobile telephony of that time was these devices needed to hold their battery charge for at least a day, if not for several days. So that talked very much to the architecture that ARM could offer. But what Nokia wanted to do was crunch more components together. Those three key components that managed all of a mobile phone's radio functions at the time: a microcontroller, M, which ARM supplied, the ASIC, and the DSP from TI, the M, the A, and the D. It's no wonder this was called the Mad Phone, because many engineers within Nokia in the north of Finland thought it just wasn't possible. It was possible. It was 137 grams in the end, and it was the first Nokia phone to use the ARM architecture. The impact was instant. In 1998, Nokia sold 20 million more handsets. Its share price tripled. It regained market leadership from Motorola to become the world's largest mobile phone handset provider. Now, what about the deal that ARM got? ARM had no bargaining power at that moment, and TI knew it, so it drove down the price. TI was supplying Nokia, and ARM was supplying TI. It drove down the royalty fee to a fraction of a cent per unit. With the future in mind, it struck a deal that if several ARM cores, if several ARM processors featured on the same chip, TI would only pay a single royalty, and the deal would be struck in perpetuity. As far as I'm aware, they don't talk about these things commercially, but this deal still exists today between ARM and TI. Now, this arguably was the worst deal ever, but because of the volumes and because of the baseline it set, and because of this idea about ubiquity and profitability, it set a baseline, and arguably it wasn't just the breakthrough with Nokia, but it was the financing relationship with TI that helped ARM prosper from then on, and certainly people were knocking on their door as soon as the 6110 was out. Second bite of Apple, you can see what I've done there. When Jobs returned to Apple, it was a very different company. It needed some money. The first thing actually Steve Jobs did was secure a $150 million investment from Microsoft, which doesn't get mentioned very much in the history books. The ARM IPO of 1998 was very, very helpful, not least because that $2.5 million investment in ARM by Apple turned into a profit of $800 million. And that could have been the end of the relationship. Jobs had killed the Newton, which was the knowledge navigator device that came out, by the way. That could have been the end of the relationship. Apple and ARM could have gone their separate ways. Except what happened next, of course, is an awesome decade of innovation by Apple. There was the iMac, but then in terms of the portable devices, the iPod, the iPhone, and the iPad. And ARM was involved in them every step of the way. Absolutely nothing to do with the shareholding, as far as I could tell. This was to do with a chap called Tony Fadell, who was brought in to lead the iPod project. And Tony wanted to hit the Christmas market. So he linked up with a company called Portal Player. It had developed an off-the-shelf chip system that could be used to power MP3 players, and the ARM technology was already in there. So this goes back to ARM in the early days, not staying and hunkering down in the barn in Cambridge, getting on the plane, going out, letting people use its architecture, use its building blocks and see what they could do with them. And there's something interesting about the ARM story because it's the supplier's supplier. It's not always in the room when the big decisions are made, but that hasn't mattered over time. It's become the default option. And it's interesting, so few companies and technologies made the jump from dumb phone to smartphone. Not many people using Nokias today, for example. But the ARM architecture did, and it worked, and it was flexible, and they kept innovating. And ARM built its part up. I mean, it was a bit part on a baseband chip, and now it controls the mobile applications processor, the primary chip that runs the operating system and the apps in a smartphone. I think its market share, as it said in its IPO prospectus, is 99%. And all that stat meant that a lot of financial journalists, sort of friends of mine, said, well, who is that other 1%? And nobody could work it out. So the leadership of ARM in mobile was great news for most people, not particularly for Intel. I'll skip over this bit. These are two companies that were very different ends of the industry. Intel, of course, was dominating PCs with his x86 architecture that goes right the way back to the IBM PC that I showed a couple of slides ago. And ARM did mobile. There were very different organizations. Intel, very bold branding, and got its customers effectively to pay to promote it, which not all of them were happy with. And at the same time, of course, there were hundreds of companies that were using ARM inside, but no one knew. There was no brand awareness. Just as the RISC and CISC polar opposites kind of melted over time, as we know, the PC and mobile worlds collided. And where are we? Yeah, this chap, Paul Otellini, was the CEO of Intel, and he won some Apple business. He won the Mac in 2005, but he wanted more. He wanted to get into mobile. He couldn't get the price right for the iPhone opportunity because he couldn't believe that the volumes would be as high as Apple said they would be. The key thing really was that Intel couldn't face cannibalizing the x86 architecture. There's a high margin there that it risked losing. And even though it came out with something called the Atom, which was lower power, but not as low power as ARM, it just couldn't get the business. So why did Apple stick with ARM again? Sorry, this should say 2020, which it switched to the Mac for in 2020. I think the reason is probably interesting looking at what Jobs said, why he hadn't chosen Intel when he could have done, particularly when it made such a strong play for the iPad. He said that Intel was slow, it was inflexible, and it would sell its ideas to their competitors. And one thing that ARM has achieved over the years, it's set up this structure, this kind of Switzerland of semiconductors. It will work with everyone, with all of these rivals. It will use that knowledge to infuse its architecture and its designs, but it's not playing any of these companies off against each other. Where are we? Back to Apple again for a third bite. 2008 was a huge year for ARM. It's the moment that it passed 10 billion royalties, 10 billion units of that it took its designs. So it was in Sony video cameras, Garmin navigation systems, car braking systems, Samsung disk drives, Toshiba televisions, and clearly the iPhone was doing great things for it. So 3 things happened that year. This is a chap called Johnny Shruji. He was hired by Apple. He was a very senior Intel and IBM chip designer. A couple of weeks after Johnny was hired, Apple made an acquisition that wasn't much commented on at the time, PA Semi, Palo Alto Semi. It bought its own chip designer. And this really marked the beginning of the custom silicon era. So compared to what had happened a generation ago when companies were hiring everything in, using specialists, buying in designs, and buying in chips, the consumers of the chip, like Apple, decided that there was real competitive advantage, there was real marginal benefits to be had from designing their own chips. The design was too important to leave to the chip makers. Now, this could have been terrible news for ARM, but actually it was brilliant news, because the third thing that Apple did in those spring weeks of 2008 was that it called Apple and it requested an architecture license. And this was, if you imagine that the standard license for ARM was where a customer gained access to the dictionary, to the language that ARM looked after. This effectively was Apple buying the dictionary and saying, well, we want to be able to cut the dictionary up and sellotape it back together again in the way that we see fit. And that is something that's carried on to this day, rather than licensing those building blocks. The first fruits of the labor of this project was the A4 chip, which came out as part of the iPad launch in 2010. And in the years since, it's very interesting in this super competitive industry. Apple has pulled away from so many of its former suppliers, from Qualcomm, from Intel, from Samsung. It is one of the largest fabless semiconductor designers in the world. Conservatively, it's got 4,000 chip engineers within the business, probably many more by now, and it's producing its own chips for cameras, for AI, for watches, and so on. And it stuck with ARM again. And actually, in ARM's IPO prospectus from last September, one thing they did disclose, they didn't disclose very much about that Apple relationship. What they did say is that it had been extended and would run to at least 2040. And I think this is amazing. This talks to how long this industry plans ahead for, but also, if you think about those brilliant business alliances, and I alluded to the very, very successful Intel plus Windows, if you get to 2040, that's 50 years that ARM and Apple have been together. So why wouldn't Apple do without ARM? I think what ARM is providing is too convenient, too reliable, and too cheap, and I think many of its customers think that. And of all the things you could reinvent, you don't need to reinvent the language that you're working in. The instruction set architecture is not top of the list. Now, there are reports that Apple is only paying 30 cents per device to ARM. It's not a huge royalty rate when you think about the price of a smartphone in the shop. But it's a talisman for the company. And the challenge for Rene Haas, who's running ARM today, is how does he get a better deal on any front? I'll come on to that. Very briefly on SoftBank. Strange things happened in the UK in 2016. The Brexit vote was one of them. And what many people thought was an unsellable company was sold. Why was ARM unsellable? Because it had struck this Swiss model, if you like. It was working for everyone on equal terms. And what nobody thought about was that a financial buyer who wouldn't break the business model. So this was the financial buyer, Masayoshi Son. There he is on the steps in Downing Street with the Chancellor at the time, Philip Hammond. Why would SoftBank buy ARM? Well, SoftBank bought everything for many years. Slack, Uber, ByteDance, Alibaba. It even bought into Webvan. Doesn't like to talk about that one very much. And it really thought that mobile was the future, and ARM was at the center of mobile. So it thought it could benefit greatly from owning this great unique asset. I put it at the center of SoftBank. They tried to build a new business around it, which was a software platform to simplify IoT and interrogate a lot of the data. That didn't work, but what did was the increased investment. It wasn't that SoftBank put money in, but by not being on the public markets, ARM didn't have to pay out a dividend. And in the time that it was in private hands, it focused a lot more on, no dividend. It focused a lot more on various end markets. I think the issue was there was still great transferability and compatibility between sectors. But these chips and these designs are getting so much more complex, it was no longer a case of one size fits all. So if ARM wanted to really dig into automotive or high-performance computers or data centers, it needed to specialize a little bit. And from wanting to own ARM for at least 10 years, it only took Massason 3 years to start testing the market to try to sell it. Why was he doing that? Well, the company needed money. It was more of a trader of assets than a developer of them. Of course, one effort was to try to sell it to NVIDIA, a deal that collapsed in February 2022. People ask me, has the SoftBank ownership of ARM been a success? And I kind of sit on the fence and say, well, it hasn't been a failure. And I justify that by reminding people this is such a long-term business. And one stat that always makes me think of that is the particular chip design that went into the Nokia 6110, launched in 1997, still sells in volumes today. It's not in mobile phones, it's in factory machines, it's in windscreen wipers. It sells several hundred million units every day. I'll come on now to the last company, the sixth one I was going to talk about, the relationship with Amazon and the drive for data. So ARM was looking to get into data centers for a long, long time. This really is chapter 2 of the custom silicon story. Amazon, to some degree, followed the Apple lead with buying PA Semi. AWS, the common computing platform, it set up for internal use and then began renting out. It had been working with ARM for many years on the Nitro Foundation for all of these data centers. And then what it did in 2015 is it acquired a company called Annapurna. And ARM, already working with Amazon, was lying in wait. It had tried and failed to break through in data centers, working with HP, working with Broadcom, and working with Qualcomm. And it did something that it never had done. It kind of made its own luck. It seeded the market. It bought into a number of startups. And Annapurna was one of those. And what followed in the way that we got the A4 chip out of Apple to put into the iPad and other devices, Amazon AWS came out with a Graviton chip. And really borrowing from, that's the Graviton number 3 chip, Graviton 3, and really borrowed from the same reasons that Nokia teamed up with ARM. Performance, clearly very important. So much more data running through these data centers. But power has been a key thing for the server market, not least because planning permission has been blocked because these huge warehouses are sucking so much money out of the grid. So actually consuming less power is really, really important. Where this puts ARM, it now has 10% of the server market after chasing after it for at least 15 years, is another battle with Intel, which is absolutely leading that market. So a second IPO, which took place in September last year, not London this time, in NASDAQ. What was different? Well, a little bit more razzmatazz, certainly, and some diversification. Even though it strived to go into all these different markets, it's still getting more than 50% of its royalties from smartphone and consumer electronics, 40% market share in automotive, particularly powering driving systems and in-car entertainment, and 10% share in cloud computing. And what's really happening ARM is able to lean into and take advantage of is that so many industries, it hopes, are going the same way as mobile phone. They're led by software, not hardware, and really a digital device is at the heart of a growing library of software and apps. If it works for, and that's the share price, it's done pretty well. It's helped by where the Fed is with interest rates, and really. The challenge for René Haas and the company now, needing to deliver some growth for Wall Street, is can it trade out of that just the ubiquity and actually develop greater profitability as well? Clearly, it hasn't been able to squeeze a better deal out of Apple. Good luck with that one. The idea is that the company might like to try and calculate its royalty based on the value of the end device rather than just the chip. Broadly, I said that ARM was quite passive a few years back. I think it's trying to do less basic, less building block design and actually be more active. If you think in some cases that there's 100 CPU cores in one chip system, then ARM believes it's the company that can help to stitch together that system or subsystem. So it's getting more involved in that part of the market. I had this described to me like a pizza. So imagine ARM is serving up a pizza ready to slide into the oven rather than just handing over the dough. Yeah, I think that ties in with the buns from earlier. Now I need to talk also about the new cash cow and ARM China. One thing you get in any IPO prospectus is lots of risks. That's what the lawyers are there for. And two things to note that are there and thereabouts, and ARM has still done well since September on the back of it. It is suing one of its largest customers, which is never a great move, but it should be in court with Qualcomm in September. It alleges that there's been a breach of license agreements and trademark infringement. And then also on to China. Clearly, China has been a headache for many tech companies, going back to the Huawei blacklisting in 2019. Chips are at the center of the US administration's economic security agenda. That stepped up under Biden. It could step up again under Trump if he comes back in November. And it affects many companies, not just American ones, because it extends to origin technology, not just where things are made. So 2 points for ARM. It had to establish nationality for some of its products, which I found amazing to see what it could sell into China and what it couldn't. And how do you do this? You actually analyze timesheets. I didn't know this was the case. You analyze timesheets to see which engineers based where worked on which technology. And what came out of that piece of work is that Neoverse, a particular group of designs which were being used for data centers, were developed in Austin, Texas, and therefore no longer able to sell into China. But those broad versions of its architecture, version 8 and version 9, are still being sold in and being used by Huawei and others. And ARM specific here, ARM doesn't actually control ARM China. It's sold a 51% controlling stake in its operations in the country in 2018, seemingly under pressure from Beijing. There's been a whole soap opera there, falling out with the CEO, struggling to remove him. It is more stable now, but the risks related to ARM China are, well, there's a few pages of them in the prospectus. Not least, it warned people that payments could be late from ARM China, or in some cases it might not receive them at all, and it has to indemnify the company, its customers, in case of any IP infringement. Where are we now? What does the future hold for the company? Well, certainly if you're selling 30 billion royalties a year, you're doing something right, and that volume has roughly doubled over the last 6 or 7 years. But there are other bare points to note. Is ARM vulnerable to new competition? And I think this is telling. It shows something about the maturity of the company now. It used to be the plucky upstart. It was the one that was at risk of being squashed by Intel. But now it faces upstarts itself. What's the best way to compete with cheap? Well, it's free. And RISC-V, which is overseen by a foundation, it has its own architecture. The ISA came out of Berkeley, largely where ARM's ideas came from. And this technology is open and free to use. It's been used many billions of times. It's been used by NASA and numerous Chinese developers. And the people behind it say, well, actually, this is a technology standard. Standards should be free. They shouldn't be charged for. It should be like Ethernet or Bluetooth or Linux and so on. And in order to operate across the industry, ARM is the Switzerland of semiconductors, as they sometimes get called. RISC-V moved to Switzerland, which is a step that ARM never took, so they could try and abdicate themselves from this great political battle that's taking place across the chip industry. It hasn't stopped US congressmen taking a very keen interest in a technology that's been used very heavily in China, but was being developed in California. And ARM actually acknowledged the RISC-V threat when they were trying to get their NVIDIA transaction through. They said that RISC-V was less expensive and more customizable than they were. What else are on the bear case? Well, missing the AI boom. I'll come on to that, and clearly suffering in China. The bull case, though. Could the smartphone market recover? I don't think there's as much growth in the smartphone market going forward as there was, but then you can never underestimate it. It really has been the gift that has kept giving for ARM, and quite brave in a way. They IPO'd in a year, pretty terrible year for the smartphone market. Group revenues were flattish, but the market did decline. So if that comes back, they will do very well. What I've talked about, winning greater market share in data centers and automotive, and a lot of that is very much been a slow burn. And I should talk on AI. AI is something that they've talked a lot about. The question here is how essential ARM is to the AI investment and the boom that is happening and that is coming. There is an argument that a rising tide lifts all ships. It would say, well, we're at the heart of the CPU. This is the central platform on which all else runs. And that's true. And the CPU interplays with the GPU and the MPU and so on, and someone has to knit all that together. I'll leave you with one stat, though, which is this point about indispensability that I started with at the top. And it's, think of it, if you like, as the multiplier effect. The company estimates that its engineers have spent about 10 million hours on the 8th version of their processor architecture. So this is the time they've spent creating base software, tools and chips and so on for everyone else to come along and take advantage of it. In the decades since the 8th version came out, those first products were deployed. The company estimates that those software developers, the 15 million plus all around the world, have spent another 1.5 billion hours creating their apps and their software. So there's something of a virtuous circle here. Developers are drawn to the biggest market, just as the chip designers are. And I think that says to me that the ARM architecture will play a key role in modern computing for a long time to come. I seem to have wrapped that up with 90 seconds to spare, which is astonishing. I'll see what else I've got. Oh, it's Michael. I should go back to me. Yeah, I think I can finish there, can I? I can finish there. It's good to be a minute ahead after one session. So, look, thank you for listening, and I look forward to any questions later. I've got lots more stories about the company, but there isn't time in 45 minutes, maybe over a drink. Thank you very much.